The rain
Here you
came
go,
down on
sweetie.
Oak Haven like a
Hey.
Thanks,
punishment.
darling. Best
Not a
coffee.
cleansing rain, not the kind that washes the dust from the roads and leaves the world smelling fresh and new. This was the other kind. The kind that seeped into the cracks of old buildings and made the mold bloom behind the wallpaper. The kind that turned the gutters into rivers of brown water and trash. The kind that had been falling off and on for 3 straight days as if the sky itself had given up on this town and was trying to drown it slowly. Oak Haven sat in a low valley in southern Oregon, surrounded by hills thick with Douglas fir and hemlock. It had been a lumber town once, back when lumber meant something. Back when the mill ran 3 shifts and the bars stayed open until 2 in the morning, and men walked home with sawdust in their hair and money in their pockets. That was 30 years ago. Now the mill was a hollow skeleton of rusted beams and broken windows, and the men who had once worked there were either dead gone or sitting in the same bar stools they had claimed in 1985, nursing cheap beer and cheaper regrets. The town had one traffic light. It had been blinking yellow for 6 months because nobody in the county office bothered to fix it. There was a gas station, a hardware store that doubled as a post office, a church with a leaking roof, and at the center of what passed for a main street, a diner called the Rusty Spoon. The Rusty Spoon had been serving lukewarm coffee and overcooked eggs since the Eisenhower administration. The linoleum floor was the color of old teeth. The booths were patched with duct tape. The ceiling tiles were stained brown from decades of cigarette smoke that still lingered in the fibers, even though smoking had been banned indoors for years. It was the kind of place where the menu hadn't changed since 1978, and nobody complained because nobody expected anything better. On this particular Tuesday morning, the diner was quiet. The rain kept most people home. Lorraine Beckford, the waitress, who had been working double shifts for going on 11 years, stood behind the counter, wiping the same spot she had wiped 100,000 times before. She was 53 years old and looked 65. Her feet ached, her back ached, her soul ached. But she poured coffee and she smiled and she called everyone honey because that was the bar and the bar was all she had. At the counter sat 2 long-haul truckers passing through hunched-over plates of biscuits and gravy, talking in low voices about fuel prices and the highway construction outside Medford. 3 tables away from the counter, Grady Phelps, the local mechanic, sat with his back carefully turned toward the far corner of the room. He was reading the sports section of a newspaper that was 4 days old, and he was reading it very intently the way a man reads when he is trying very hard not to look at something else. The something else was sitting at a table 4. Table 4 was the corner booth tucked against the back wall beneath a flickering fluorescent light that buzzed like a dying insect. The man sitting there filled the booth the way a boulder fills a creek bed. He was enormous, 6 feet 4 inches tall and close to 280 pounds, and very little of that weight was soft. His shoulders were so wide they nearly touched both sides of the booth. His hands wrapped around a white ceramic coffee mug were the size of dinner plates, scarred across the knuckles, the skin rough as sandpaper. His name was Briggs Calloway. On the streets and in the police databases of 4 western states, he was known simply as Ironside. He was a patched member of the Hellsangels Motorcycle Club Redwood chapter, and he wore his cut the leather vest adorned with the club's insignia the way a knight wears armor. It was not decoration. It was identity. It was warning. Briggs was not a handsome man. His face looked like it had been assembled from spare parts left over from a bar fight. A thick scar ran from his left ear down to his jawline, a souvenir from a knife fight in Oakland back in 1998. His nose had been broken at least 3 times and had given up on being straight. His beard was gray and wild, the kind of beard that birds might nest in. His eyes were hidden behind dark aviator sunglasses that he wore even indoors, even in the dim light of the Rusty Spoon, because Briggs Calloway had learned long ago that if people could not see your eyes, they could not see your intentions, and that was an advantage worth more than any weapon. He was nursing a black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He had not asked for a refill. Lorraine had not offered one. She had learned in the 2 days since he had arrived in Oak Haven that this man did not want conversation. He did not want friendliness. He did not want anything except to be left alone with his coffee and his silence and whatever dark thoughts circled behind those sunglasses. Briggs was stuck. His Harley-Davidson Softail, a machine he had ridden for over 100,000 miles across the American West, had thrown its transmission 2 days ago on Highway 138 just outside of town. The part he needed was being shipped from a warehouse in Reno and would not arrive until Thursday. He was trapped in Oak Haven for at least 2 more days, sitting in a diner in a town he had never heard of, in a county that was dry, meaning no liquor, meaning no way to numb the thoughts that came for him in the quiet hours. The thoughts were always about Jolene, his daughter, 23 years old now, or maybe 24. He had lost track. She had stopped speaking to him 5 years ago after the arrest in Sacramento, after her mother had finally filed the divorce papers, after the judge had looked at his record and his affiliations and decided that a man like Briggs Calloway had no business being within 500 feet of a child, even though that child was 18 by then and legally an adult. Jolene had sat in that courtroom. She had not cried. She had not screamed. She had simply looked at him with an expression that was worse than hatred. It was disappointment. And then she had walked out and changed her phone number, and that was the end of it. 5 years of silence. 5 years of wondering if she had graduated college. 5 years of wondering if she was safe. 5 years of carrying her school photo in the hidden pocket of his cut, right next to his heart, and never showing it to anyone because men like Briggs did not talk about things like that. Men like Briggs cracked knuckles and broke jaws and rode through the night at 90 miles an hour and pretended that the wind in their ears was loud enough to drown out the sound of their own failures. The bell above the diner door jingled. A gust of cold, wet wind swept into the room, making the napkin dispenser on the counter rattle. The truckers shivered. Lorraine looked up from her wiping. A little girl stood in the doorway. She was small, so small that the door seemed enormous behind her, like the entrance to a cathedral. She could not have been more than 7 years old. She was wearing a pink raincoat that was at least 2 sizes too small, the sleeves riding up past her wrists, the zipper straining across her chest. Her sneakers were soaked through the canvas, dark with water, and they made a squelching sound against the linoleum with every step. Her hair was the color of wet straw, plastered flat against her forehead, dripping water down her cheeks, like tears that had not yet decided to be tears. She stood there for a moment, shivering, her eyes scanning the room with a frantic, searching quality that made Lorraine's heart clench. She looked lost. Or perhaps she looked like she was looking for someone who was supposed to be there but was not. Lorraine called out from behind the counter, "Honey, where are your parents? You cannot be in here by yourself." The girl did not answer. Her eyes moved past the truckers, past Grady and his old newspaper, past the empty tables and the stained ceiling, and the buzzing fluorescent lights. Her eyes stopped at table 4, at the massive dark figure of Briggs Calloway. The diner went silent. It was not a gradual silence. It was instant. The clinking of forks stopped. The low murmur of the truckers ceased. Even the hum of the refrigerator in the back seemed to drop in pitch, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Briggs felt the silence. He felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room shifting toward him. He did not turn around. He stared at the cold black liquid in his mug. His knuckles whitened around the handle. "Do not come over here," he thought. "Do not bother me. Keep walking. Whatever you need, it is not here. It is not Meitong." But the footsteps did not walk past. The wet squelch of small sneakers got closer and closer and closer. Briggs turned his head slowly. The girl was standing right there, not 2 feet from his table. She was so small that her head barely cleared the top of the booth. Up close, he could see that she was trembling, and not just from the cold. There was something deeper shaking her, something that came from a place that cold and rain could not reach. Her lower lip quivered. Her eyes were wide and enormous in her thin face, and they were filled with a mixture of raw terror and something else. Something that Briggs, in all his years of reading people in dangerous situations, could only describe as desperate determination. He lowered his sunglasses, peering over the rim. His eyes were blue, surprisingly so, a pale winter blue that seemed out of place in that scarred and brutal face. But they were hard. Hard as flint. "You lost, kid." His voice came out as a deep rumble, the kind of sound that made most grown men take a step backward. It was the voice of gravel tumbling in a concrete mixer. It was the voice of engines and violence and long highways at midnight. The girl did not step backward. She swallowed hard. Then she reached into the pocket of her pink raincoat. Every muscle in Briggs Calloway's body went rigid. He had been in the life long enough to know that threats came in all shapes and sizes, that danger wore every possible face, and that the moment you assumed someone was harmless was the moment you ended up bleeding on a barroom floor. But she did not pull out a weapon. She pulled out a dollar bill. It was crumpled and damp soft from being held in a sweaty palm for too long. It was old, the kind of bill that had been through 100 pockets in 1,000 transactions, and it looked like the most precious thing in the world the way she held it. She held it out to him. Her hand was shaking so badly that the bill fluttered like a leaf in a storm. "For your coffee," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the sound of the rain hammering against the window. Briggs stared at the dollar. Then he stared at the girl. For the first time in 20 years, Briggs Calloway could not find words. He had faced down armed men in dark alleys. He had stood toe-to-toe with rival club members twice his size. He had been shot at, stabbed, arrested, and left for dead on the side of a desert highway. None of those experiences had left him speechless. But this did. A 7-year-old girl in a pink raincoat holding out a crumpled dollar bill with a shaking hand undid him completely. He looked around the diner. Grady had abandoned any pretense of reading his newspaper and was gaping openly. Lorraine had frozen mid-pour coffee overflowing from a trucker's mug and pooling on the counter. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Briggs looked back at the girl. "What?" She took a ragged breath. The tears that had been building behind her eyes finally broke free, spilling over her lashes and cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "My mommy says that even bad men have good hearts if you look deep enough. And I need a favor, but I have to pay for it. This is all I have." The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other, rehearsed but barely held together. These were not her words. They were words she had been given, words she had memorized, words that had been pressed into her memory by someone who loved her enough to plan for the worst. Briggs felt something shift in his chest. It was a tightening, a pressure behind his ribs that he had not felt in 5 years. Not since the last time he had seen Jolene. Not since the courtroom. This girl, this soaking wet, shivering child, was standing in front of a Hell's Angel in a greasy diner, calling him a bad man to his face and offering him her last dollar. There was a courage in that act that Briggs recognized. It was the courage of someone who had no other options. He pushed her hand away gently. "I do not need your money, kid, and I do not do favors. Go find your mom." The dam broke. The girl sobbed, a sound so raw and sudden that it made Lorraine flinch behind the counter. "I cannot. She will not wake up. She told me if anything ever happened, I had to find the strongest person I could find. And you are the strongest person here." The silence in the diner shifted. It went from tension to something darker, something colder. Horror. The truckers exchanged glances. Grady set down his newspaper. Lorraine put a hand over her mouth. Briggs looked at the dollar bill again. It was likely her lunch money or money her mother had hidden away for emergencies. This child had walked through a rainstorm to find a stranger, the most frightening stranger in the room, and was trying to hire him like a mercenary with a single crumpled dollar. Because her mother had told her to. Because her mother had planned for this. He looked at Lorraine. "Call 911. The reaction was immediate and violent. The girl screamed, a sound of pure animal panic. "No! No police!" She lunged forward and grabbed Briggs's leather vest with both hands, her tiny fingers clutching the heavy material with a strength that seemed impossible for someone her size. "Mommy said no police. They will take me away. Please, please, just come wake her up." There was a desperation in that voice that cut through every layer of cynicism Briggs had built around himself over the past 3 decades. No police. That phrase meant something specific. In Briggs's world, calling the cops usually made things worse, not better. He understood that code. He had lived by it his entire adult life. But there was something else in the way this girl said it. She was not parroting street wisdom. She was following instructions, specific instructions given to her by the mother who had a very particular reason to fear the police. He looked down at her. She was still holding the dollar out with one hand, still gripping his vest with the other. "Keep your money," Briggs said. He stood up. He rose to his full height, and the girl had to crane her neck back so far to look at him that she nearly fell over backward. The shadow he cast swallowed her whole. He blocked out the fluorescent light above, and for a moment standing over this tiny creature. In her ridiculous pink raincoat, Briggs Calloway looked like a mountain that had decided to walk. "Show me," he said. He threw a $5 bill on the table for his own coffee and did not wait for change. As he walked toward the door, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum, the girl scrambled to keep up. Her small pink form trotted alongside his massive black silhouette like a tugboat beside an aircraft carrier. As they reached the door, Lorraine whispered to Grady across the counter, "Should we stop him? He is a Hell's Angel." Grady shook his head slowly, watching through the rain-streaked window as the giant biker lifted the little girl onto the back of his motorcycle and draped his own heavy leather jacket around her shoulders. It hung past her knees like a blanket. "I do not think he is the one we need to worry about right now," Grady said quietly. Outside, Briggs strapped his only helmet onto the girl's small head. It was comically oversized, making her look like a bobblehead doll. He would ride without protection. That was the trade. "What is your name, kid?" "Rosie," she said from inside the helmet, her voice echoing slightly. "Where are we going, Rosie?" "The Starlight Motel. Room 9. Briggs knew the Starlight. It sat on the outskirts of Oak Haven like a wound that refused to heal. It was the kind of place known for hourly rates and cockroaches and people who did not want to be found. It was not a place for a 7-year-old girl. The fact that she lived there made something dark and hot rise in the back of Briggs's throat. He fired the Harley to life. The engine roared through the narrow street, bouncing off the brick walls of the buildings. The vibrations seemed to shake the rain right out of the air. Rosie wrapped her arms around his waist and held on with a grip that surprised him. For someone so small, she held on like she had done this before, like she had been taught to hold on to things. The ride was short, but the seconds stretched. The rain stung Briggs's face. He had given her the helmet, leaving his eyes and skin exposed to the elements. But he did not blink. He was running scenarios in his head. Overdose was the most likely. Domestic violence a close second. If he walked into that room and found a dead body and the cops showed up, he was going down. A Hell's Angel at a crime scene with a dead woman and a kid. The headlines would write themselves. The DA would not even have to try. "Turn around, Briggs." A voice in his head, the voice that had kept him alive for 50 years, the voice of pure self-preservation. "Drop her at the fire station. Right away. This is not your problem. You do not even know these people." But then he felt her small head lean against his back. She was not just holding on to his waist. She was resting against him, trusting him. She had paid him $1. In Briggs's world, a deal was a deal. A contract was a contract. The amount did not matter. The honor of the agreement did. He pulled into the Starlight's parking lot. The neon sign out front was dying, half the letters burned out, the ones that remained flickering weakly in the gray daylight. Puddles the size of small ponds filled the cracked pavement. A rusted Chevy Impala sat on blocks near the dumpster. A stray dog, a mangy shepherd mix, cowered under the awning near the ice machine, watching them with yellow eyes. "Room 9, Rosie said, jumping off the bike with a practiced ease that told Briggs she was used to getting on and off things quickly. She handed him the helmet and did not wait for him. She ran toward a door near the back of the complex, a door whose green paint was peeling so badly it looked like the skin of something dead. Briggs followed. His heavy boots crunched on the gravel. He scanned the perimeter out of habit. No police cars, no obvious lookouts, no one watching from the other rooms. Just the dough and the rain and the smell of mildew and neglect. Rosie pushed the door open. It was not locked. That was the first bad sign. In a place like this, an unlocked door meant either the occupant could not get up to lock it or someone had already been inside. Briggs ducked his head to enter. He was too tall for the doorframe and had to angle his shoulders sideways. The smell hit him immediately. It was not the metallic tang of blood. It was not the chemical burn of methamphetamine or the sweet rot of heroin. Those smells he knew, and he had braced himself for them. This was different. This was the smell of sickness. Old soup, rubbing alcohol, damp fabric that had been wet too long, and underneath it all, a faint sour scent that Briggs recognized from field hospitals and from the time his buddy Waco had caught a staph infection that nearly killed him. It was the smell of a body fighting a war it was losing. The room was dim. A single window with thin yellowed curtains let in a rectangle of gray light that illuminated a space no bigger than a jail cell. There was a hot plate in one corner sitting on a milk crate, a pile of clothes neatly folded despite the poverty of the surroundings, and books. School books, the kind with bright covers and large print, stacked carefully beside a small television that looked like it had not worked in months. Despite the squalor, someone had tried to make this room a home. There were drawings taped to the wall, Crayon drawings of houses with smoke coming from chimneys, of flowers, and toast and stick figures holding hands under yellow suns. A child's drawings, Rosie's drawings. This was not a den of addiction. This was a trap. Someone was living here not because they wanted to, but because they had nowhere else to go. On the bed, buried under a pile of mismatched blankets, lay a woman. She was thin, too thin. The kind of thin that comes not from vanity, but from months of choosing between feeding yourself and feeding your child, and choosing the child every single time. Her cheekbones pressed against her skin like they were trying to escape. Her hair, dark and matted, was plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her skin was the color of old paper gray and damp, and she was trembling beneath the blankets even though the room was warm and close. Mommy, Rosie whispered. She crept toward the bed, moving carefully the way you approach something fragile. I brought him. I brought the strong man, just like you said. The woman stirred, her eyelids fluttered. They opened partway, glassy and unfocused, like someone looking up through deep water. She saw Rosie first and something crossed her face. Relief. Then her gaze drifted upward to the doorway, to the hulking silhouette of Briggs Calloway, filling the frame, dripping rainwater onto the stained carpet. She did not scream. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had used up all her fear a long time ago and had nothing left but a weary, bone-deep resignation. You came, she rasped. Her voice was a dry crackle like paper tearing. Briggs stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. Your girl said you would not wake up. She said no cops. What is going on here? The woman tried to sit up. She made it about 3 inches off the pillow before her arms buckled and she collapsed back. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, each exhale carrying a faint wheeze that spoke of lungs working overtime to keep a failing body alive. Rosie was already moving. She went to the nightstand where 3 orange prescription bottles stood in a row. She picked them up one by one and held them up for Briggs to see, shaking each one. Empty, empty, empty. These are Mommy's medicines, Rosie said. Her voice had shifted. She was no longer the terrified child from the diner. She was focused, practical, a 7-year-old who had been forced to learn things no 7-year-old should know. This one is for her sugar. This one is for the infection. This one is for the pain. They have been empty since Saturday. Briggs looked at the bottles. Insulin, antibiotics. The third one was a generic painkiller. He looked back at the woman. She was watching him with those glassy eyes, and she must have seen the suspicion in his face, the calculation, because she shook her head slightly. Not drugs, she wheezed. Diabetes. In the leg. Look. She pulled the blanket down. Briggs hissed through his teeth. Her lower leg was wrapped in bandages that had not been changed in days. They were stained brown and yellow. But it was not the bandages that made Briggs suck air through his teeth. It was the angry red streaks running up her shin like the branches of a poison tree climbing toward her knee, disappearing under the edge of the bandage. The skin around the wound was swollen and hot-looking, stretched tight and shining with a sickly gloss. Sepsis. She was going septic. The infection was in her blood now, spreading through her body like fire through dry timber. And she was a diabetic without insulin, which meant her body had no way to fight back. She was dying. Not in the abstract, not in the someday everyone dies sense. She was dying right now in this room, in this bed in front of her daughter. You need a hospital, Briggs said flatly. The woman Colleen grabbed the sheets with fingers that were white at the tips. Cannot. No insurance in Vance. If I leave this room today, he locks us out. Today is collection day. If I am not here with the money, he changes the locks. Rosie will have nowhere to go. Who is Vance? Briggs asked. The landlord, Rosie said. Her voice was quiet but steady. He is mean. He carries a baseball bat. He comes every Tuesday at noon. Briggs checked his watch. It was 11:42. He looked around the room again. The hot plate, the folded clothes, the school books, the crayon drawings on the wall. He thought about the dollar bill. He thought about this girl walking through the rain to find him. He thought about the empty medicine bottles and the instructions and the way Rosie had picked up each bottle and explained them like a nurse giving a briefing. This woman had prepared her daughter for this moment. That was not the behavior of someone who had given up. That was the behavior of someone who had spent months, maybe years, planning for the day she could no longer protect her child herself. Colleen reached under her pillow. The movement was slow and painful, and Briggs tensed, but what came out was not a weapon. It was a small black USB drive attached to a keychain. The keychain had a plastic unicorn on it, the kind of cheap trinket you get from a grocery store vending machine. It was the kind of thing a child would pick out. Rosie probably had chosen it. Colleen held it out. Not to Briggs, to Rosie. And Rosie took it, turned and placed it in Briggs' rough palm. The handoff was practiced, deliberate, mother to daughter to protector. It is not just rent. Colleen gasped. I was the bookkeeper. For the mayor. For the sheriff. For all of them, Vance is just the bagman. He collects the rent. He collects other things too. Briggs closed his hand around the USB drive. The plastic unicorn pressed into his palm. What is on here? Everything, Colleen whispered. The trafficking, the opioids. They move it through the old lumber yard on Route 7. Shipments come in as raw timber packed inside the logs. They have been doing it for years. My husband, Emmett, he worked at the yard. He found the shipments. He told me, we were going to go to the state police. She paused. A cough racked her body deep and wet, and Rosie pressed a damp washcloth to her mother's forehead without being asked. They killed him. Colleen continued when the coughing passed. Cut the brake lines on his truck, made it look like he lost control on the mountain road. Everyone said it was an accident. Everyone believed it, because Sheriff Holcomb told them to believe it. And when you cannot trust the law becomes the cage. I ran, she said. I took Rosie in the drive, and I ran. We have been hiding here for 5 months, paying Vance in cash, staying invisible. I was saving money to get us out of state, enough for bus tickets and a security deposit somewhere they would never look. But then the leg got infected, and the insulin ran out. And I could not get to a doctor because doctors ask questions, and questions lead to records, and records lead to Holcomb. She grabbed Briggs's vest with a sudden startling strength, pulling him closer. Her eyes were clearer now, sharpened by adrenaline and desperation. Sheriff Holcomb is the head of the snake, she said, each word deliberate, each word a nail being driven into a coffin. If he finds us, he will not arrest me. He will make us disappear. The way he made Emmett disappear. The way he makes everyone disappear who threatens his operation. Rosie was standing beside the bed, and she was not crying. She was watching, listening. Her face had the expression of a child who had heard this story before, who had lived inside this story for 5 months, who understood the weight of what her mother was saying, even if she could not fully comprehend the details. She knew the bad man. She knew the danger. She knew the plan. Mama planned everything, Rosie said quietly, looking at Briggs. She told me what to say. She told me to find someone strong who was not from here, someone who did not work for the sheriff. She said if I found someone like that and paid them, they would help, because people who take money keep their promises. Briggs looked at the unicorn USB drive in his hand. He looked at Colleen, gray and sweating and barely clinging to consciousness. He looked at Rosie, 7 years old, standing straight, holding a washcloth, the bravest person he had met in 30 years of riding with men who called themselves brave. He tucked the USB drive into the hidden pocket inside his cut, the pocket where he kept Jolene's school photo. The drive sat next to the photo, and something about that proximity, evidence of corruption next to the face of the daughter he had failed, felt like fate pulling a thread tight. Rest, Briggs said to Colleen. Help is coming. He checked his watch again. 11:51, 9 minutes until Vance Pruitt. Briggs moved quickly. He took the flimsy wooden chair from the corner of the room and placed it directly in front of the door. He sat down. He crossed his massive arms over his chest. He cracked his knuckles, and the sound was like a branch snapping in the silence of the room. Rosie, he said, I need you to do something. Find me anything sweet. Juice, candy, sugar packets. Anything. Your mom's blood sugar might be crashing, and she needs energy to fight the infection. Rosie moved immediately, rummaging through a cardboard box that served as their pantry. She found a half-empty bottle of orange juice, the cap crusted with dried pulp. She brought it to the bed and, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands so small, tilted it against her mother's lips. Colleen drank. Weakly, a few sips, but she drank. Briggs watched this and thought about the dollar bill in his pocket. He thought about the fact that this child had spent her last cent on him. Not on food, not on medicine. On the chance that a stranger might help? You paid for a favor, Kid. Briggs set his eyes forward, staring at the door. You are about to get your money's worth. 11:58. Outside, the sound of a heavy engine approached. Not a motorcycle. Something bigger. The crunch of expensive tires on cheap gravel. A vehicle that did not belong in a place like the Starlight, the same way a silk tie does not belong in a coal mine. A car door slammed, heavy footsteps on the concrete walkway. Then a voice loud and sharp and soaked in petty authority, the voice of a man who had spent years intimidating people who could not fight back. Open up, Colleen. I know you are in there. Time to pay the piper. The words were followed by the thud of something hard and wooden striking the door. Once, twice. The door rattled in its frame. Briggs did not move. He sat in the chair with his arms crossed and watched the door handle begin to turn. A small, cold smile settled onto his lips. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had been angry for 2 days and had finally found somewhere to put it. The handle jiggled. The door held. Briggs had thrown the deadbolt when he sat down. Do not make me break this down, the voice shouted from outside. I will throw you and that brat out into the rain myself. You think I am playing? You owe me 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Colleen, and we both know there are other ways to pay if you do not have the cash. Behind him, Briggs heard Rosie's breath catch. He heard the fear in that small intake of air, and he heard something else. He heard the way Colleen, even in her delirium, tried to push herself upright at those last words. Other ways to pay. The implication was clear. The rage that had been simmering in Briggs's chest since he walked into this room went from a simmer to a boil. He stood up slowly. He was in no hurry. Men like Vance Pruitt thrived on urgency, on catching their victims off guard, on making them scramble. Briggs would not scramble for anyone. He walked to the door, he turned the deadbolt, and he ripped the door open. Standing on the concrete step was a man in a beige trench coat that was too expensive for this motel and too cheap for actual wealth. He had slicked back hair and a thin mouth and eyes that were set too close together, giving him the permanent look of a man doing unpleasant arithmetic. He was maybe 50, soft in the middle, with the kind of tan that came from a booth rather than the sun. In his right hand, raised halfway like a threat he was used to not having to follow through on, was an aluminum baseball bat. His sneer curdled the instant he realized he was not looking at a sick woman in a bed. He was looking into the chest of a Hell's Angel. Briggs filled the doorway. His shoulders touched both sides of the frame. His head nearly scraped the top. He blocked the light from outside so completely that Vance Pruitt was suddenly standing in shadow. Mr. Pruitt, I presume, Briggs said. His voice was polite, almost pleasant. Vance blinked. He lowered the bat slightly, though he did not drop it. Who the hell are you? I am the new tenant. Briggs lied. He stepped out into the rain and pulled the door closed behind him so that Rosie would not have to see what was about to happen. And I have a few complaints about the heating. He moved so fast that Vance did not even have time to flinch. Briggs snatched the baseball bat out of his hand the way you take a toy from a child. Then he gripped it at both ends and snapped it over his knee. The aluminum shrieked and bent, then cracked the sound, echoing across the parking lot like a gunshot. Briggs tossed the two halves onto the wet gravel. Vance stumbled backward, his expensive shoes slipping on the wet concrete. His face had gone the color of old oatmeal. Briggs stepped into his space. He got close. Close enough that Vance could see every scar, every line, every year of violence carved into that face. Close enough that Vance could smell the coffee on his breath and the leather of his vest and the rain on his skin. Now Briggs growled, "Let us talk about the rent. The lady in that room does not owe you anything. Not today, not ever again. You are going to walk to your truck. You are going to drive away. And you are never going to come back to this door. If I see you here again, the bat will not be the only thing I break." Vance scrambled backward toward his truck, a black Ford F-250 with chrome trim and mud on the fenders. He slipped on the gravel and went down on one knee, his trench coat smearing with mud. He pulled himself up, using the truck's door handle. His face twisted with fear and fury. "You are making a mistake," Vance screamed, fumbling for his keys. "You think this is about rent, you stupid biker trash. You have no idea who owns this town. You have no idea what you just stepped into." Briggs memorized the license plate. He stood in the rain and watched the truck peel out of the parking lot, tires screeching on the wet asphalt. He watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner. Then he stood there a moment longer, letting the cold water wash over his face, cooling the heat that was burning under his skin. Who owns this town? Those words landed differently now that he had the USB drive in his pocket. Now that he knew about Sheriff Holcomb and the lumberyard and Emmett Mercer's brake lines, he went back inside. The situation had worsened. Colleen was convulsing slightly, her body shaking beneath the blankets in rhythmic tremors that spoke of systems beginning to fail. Her skin had gone from gray to something closer to blue at the edges. Rosie was pressing the washcloth to her mother's forehead, weeping silently, tears running down her face without sound the way children cry when they have learned that noise brings danger. She is burning up. Rosie hiccuped. Briggs knelt by the bed. He placed his hand on Colleen's forehead. It was like touching a stove burner. He pulled back the bandage on her leg just enough to see that the red streaks had climbed higher. They were past her knee now, reaching toward her thigh. The infection was spreading fast. Hours, maybe less. He pulled his phone from his vest pocket. It was a heavy waterproof thing, the kind of phone designed to survive being dropped off a motorcycle at highway speed. He did not dial 911. He dialed a number he had not called in 6 months. It rang once. Yeah. The voice that answered was gravelly sharp and fully alert despite the early hour. It was the voice of a man who slept with one eye open because the world had taught him to. "It is Ironside," Briggs said. There was a pause on the other end, a pause that carried weight. "Ironside, you are supposed to be in California by now. I have your GPS pinging in some armpit town called Oak Haven." "What gives bike trouble and a complication?" Briggs said. "I need Patch. I need him now. And I need the pack. All of them." The voice belonged to Grizz Donovan, the president of the Nomad chapter. He was a man as wide as a vending machine with a beard that reached his belt buckle and a mind as sharp as a straight razor behind a face that looked like it had been carved from a tree stump. He had led the chapter for 11 years and had kept every member alive, which in their world was the only measure of leadership that mattered. What kind of complication requires the whole chapter, brother? Civilians. A woman and a kid. Woman is going septic. Diabetic. No insulin. Cannot go to the hospital. Why not? Because her landlord just tried to break her door down with a bat and she is terrified of the cops. Something is rotten here, Grizz. The landlord said something about who owns this town. I think the law is the thing she is running from. Grizz was silent for a moment. The Hells Angels generally avoided civilian entanglements. They were bad for business and worse for freedom. But the club had a code, unwritten but ironclad, regarding women and children in distress. And if Ironside, the most stoic and self-contained man in the chapter, was asking for backup, then the situation was beyond what muscle alone could solve. "What is your 20 Starlight Motel?" "West side of town, off Route 7. We are 2 hours out. We were headed up I-5. We will cut across. Patch is riding in the van with the field kit. Can you hold the line for 2 hours?" Briggs looked at the flimsy door. He looked at the dying woman. He looked at Rosie, who had stopped crying and was staring at him with those enormous eyes waiting. "I will hold it," Briggs said. "Bring everything." He hung up. Rosie was watching him. "Who was that family?" Briggs said. He moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. The parking lot was empty. The stray dog had disappeared. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the sky was darker than before, as if the clouds were regrouping for another assault. Vance Pruitt would not just drive away and forget about this. Men like that did not absorb humiliation. They took it straight to whoever held their leash and came back with more teeth. And now Briggs knew who held the leash. Sheriff Holcomb, a man with badges and guns and the authority to kick in any door in this county. Rosie, Briggs said, turning from the window. "I need you to be brave. Can you do that?" She nodded. She wiped her nose on her sleeve. She squared her small shoulders the way Briggs had seen soldiers square theirs before walking into a fight. This girl had been brave her entire short life. She did not need his permission, but he gave it anyway because sometimes hearing someone say the words out loud is the only thing that keeps you standing. 2 hours, Briggs said. "We hold this room for 2 hours. Then help arrives." He shoved the heavy dresser against the window. He wedged the chair back under the doorknob. He checked the deadbolt twice. Then he sat on the floor beside the bed, positioning himself between the door and the two people he had been hired to protect. Hired for $1 by a 7-year-old girl in a pink raincoat. He pulled the Bowie knife from his boot and began cleaning his fingernails with the tip. The blade was 8 inches long and sharp enough to shave with. It caught the gray light from the curtains and threw it around the room in small bright flashes. Colleen's eyes fluttered open one more time. She was looking at Rosie, who had climbed onto the bed and curled up against her mother's side, one small arm draped across Colleen's chest. "You did good, baby," Colleen whispered. Her hand found Rosie's hair and stroked it weakly. "You did everything right. Mommy is so proud." Rosie pressed her face into her mother's shoulder. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She had done what her mother asked. She had found the strongest person she could find. She had paid him with everything she had. And now she was lying beside her mother, holding on, because that was all she had left to give. Briggs watched them and thought about Jolene. He thought about the last time he had held his own daughter years ago before everything went wrong. He thought about how he had failed to protect her, not from violence, but from himself, from the life he had chosen, from the wreckage that life left in its wake. He gripped the knife tighter. Outside, the rain picked up again. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the hills. And on Interstate 5, 2 hours south, 50 motorcycles changed course and pointed their front wheels toward Oak Haven. The clock on the nightstand read 12:15. Vance Pruitt had been gone for 17 minutes. That meant Holcomb probably already knew. The countdown had started. Briggs Calloway sat in a dim motel room, guarding a dying woman and her daughter with a knife and a promise. He was no longer a biker waiting for a transmission part. He was the wall between a little girl and the darkness that wanted to swallow her whole. And that dollar bill in his pocket, crumpled and damp and worth exactly 100 cents, had just become the most expensive payment he had ever received, because it was going to cost him everything. The first sign of trouble was not a siren, it was the silence. The rain had eased around 1 in the afternoon, not stopping entirely, but pulling back, retreating to a fine mist that hung over the Starlight Motel like gauze over a wound. The air was thick and humid, the kind of stillness that pressed against your skin and made breathing feel like work. The puddles in the parking lot had stopped rippling. The dripping from the gutters had slowed to a metronome tick, and then gradually even that stopped. The birds went quiet first. The sparrows that had been chattering in the eaves of the motel office disappeared. The crows that circled the dumpster at the far end of the lot lifted off in a ragged black cloud and did not come back. The stray dog, the mangy shepherd mix that had been sheltering under the awning near the ice machine, stood up, sniffed the air once, and trotted away with its tail between its legs, vanishing around the corner of the building as if it had received a warning that only animals could hear. Briggs noticed. He had been pacing the room for the past 40 minutes, 3 steps from the window to the door, and 3 steps back, a caged animal wearing a path in the thin carpet. His knife was back in his boot. His phone showed 1:15. Grizz and the chapter were still 45 minutes out. Maybe 40 if they pushed it. Colleen was unconscious again. The orange juice had bought her a brief window of lucidity, but that window had closed. Her breathing had changed. It was shallower now, each inhale a thin whistle, each exhale a rattle that sounded like dice shaking in a cup. The red streaks on her leg had climbed past her knee and were creeping up her thigh. Patch needed to get here soon, or there would be no one left to save. Rosie was asleep. Briggs had told her to rest, and she had obeyed without argument, curling up in the bathtub where he had laid blankets and pillows to make a nest. He had chosen the bathtub because it was the most protected spot in the room. Cast iron bolted to the floor, surrounded by tile walls. If things went bad, if bullets started flying, the bathtub was the closest thing to a bunker this motel room could offer. Rosie had not questioned this. She had simply climbed in, pulled the blanket to her chin, and fallen asleep with the immediacy of a child whose body had decided that exhaustion outranked fear. Her pink raincoat hung over the shower rod above her, dripping steadily onto the tile floor. Briggs moved to the window. He pressed his eye to the gap between the curtain and the frame, the same gap he had been checking every 2 minutes for the past hour. The parking lot was empty, and that was wrong. An hour ago, there had been a few cars scattered around. A beat-up sedan near room 3, a white pickup near the office. An old RV that looked like it had not moved in months. Now they were all gone. The lot was bare except for his Harley parked directly outside the door. Someone had cleared the area. Someone had told the other tenants to leave. Or someone had made them leave. Then he heard it, the low crunch of tires on wet gravel. Slow, deliberate, the sound of a vehicle trying not to be heard. Briggs shifted his angle at the window. A black SUV rolled into the parking lot from the north entrance. No headlights, no emergency lights. Just a dark shape moving through the mist like a shark through murky water. It was followed 10 seconds later by a sheriff's cruiser, brown and tan light bar on the roof, the county seal on the door. And then a second cruiser pulling in from the south entrance, boxing the lot. 3 vehicles, 2 marked, 1 unmarked. That meant at least 6 men, probably more. They parked in a loose semicircle facing room 9, keeping their distance engines idling. Nobody got out immediately. They were assessing, they were positioning, they were doing the things that men with guns do before they use them. Briggs stepped back from the window. His heart rate, which had been elevated since noon, settled into a steady, heavy thump. Not fast, not panicked. The rhythm of a man who had been in enough dangerous situations to know that panic was a luxury he could not afford. He checked his phone, sent a single text to Grizz. 3 words. They are here. The response came back in 4 seconds. 30 minutes. Hold. 30 minutes. In a gunfight, 30 minutes was a geological age. Empires rose and fell in 30 minutes. Men lived and died in 30 minutes. Briggs looked at Colleen on the bed and Rosie in the bathtub and calculated the odds of keeping them both alive for 30 minutes against 6 armed men, and the number he came up with was not encouraging. A voice boomed across the parking lot. It was amplified by a loudspeaker, tinny and distorted, but unmistakable. It carried the smooth, practiced cadence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The kind of voice that won elections and silenced courtrooms and made people believe things that were not true. This is Sheriff Holcomb. We have received reports of a violent disturbance in a possible hostage situation at the Starlight Motel Room 9. Occupant, come out with your hands raised. We are aware that a woman and a child are inside. We are here to ensure their safety. Briggs snorted. Hostage situation. The narrative was already written. The story had already been decided before they arrived. A dangerous biker, a Hell's Angel, had taken a local woman and her daughter hostage. If they had to breach the room and the biker resisted, well, that was a tragedy, but an understandable one. If the woman happened to die in the crossfire, that was collateral damage. If the USB drive disappeared from evidence, nobody would ever know it existed. Holcomb was not here to rescue anyone. He was here to clean house. Briggs cracked the door open, just enough to be heard, not enough to present a target. The chain was still on, though a chain that thin would not stop a determined boot. No hostages here, Sheriff Briggs called out. His voice was steady, almost conversational. Just a sick woman who needs a doctor. She is not fit to move. There was a pause. Then Holcomb's voice came back, this time without the loudspeaker. He had stepped out of the SUV. Through the crack in the door, Briggs could see him. Tall, silver hair, square jaw, the kind of face that belonged on a campaign poster. He was wearing his uniform pressed and crisp, the star on his chest, catching what little light filtered through the overcast sky. He looked like law and order incarnate. He looked like the kind of man you would trust with your life. We have an ambulance en route, Holcomb said. His tone was friendly now, neighborly. Send her out, son. We will take good care of her, I bet you will, Briggs muttered under his breath. He raised his voice. She is not going anywhere with you. My own medical transport is on the way. We will wait. The friendliness evaporated from Holcomb's face like water on a hot skillet. He turned to his deputies, 3 men who had exited the cruisers and were standing behind their open doors with hands resting on holstered weapons. He made a small gesture, a flick of his wrist, and the deputies unholstered their sidearms. You are interfering with a police investigation and endangering a minor, Holcomb called out. His voice had gone cold and official, the mask of civility discarded. I am giving you 2 minutes to surrender or we are coming in. Briggs slammed the door shut. He locked the deadbolt. He shoved the dresser back against the window with a single heave that scraped deep grooves into the floor. Rosie, he called out softly toward the bathroom. Put your hands over your ears. Keep your head down. Count to 1,000. Can you do that? A small voice came back, trembling, but obedient. Okay. Briggs pulled the Sig Sauer P226 from his waistband. He checked the magazine. 15 rounds. He had 1 spare magazine. 30 rounds total against men with AR-15 in their trunks and the legal authority to use them. The math was ugly. He needed time. Not a victory, just time. He grabbed the rubbing alcohol from the nightstand and poured it across the carpet in front of the door. It was not much, but if they breached, the fumes would sting their eyes for a few seconds. A few seconds could be the difference between living and not living. He flipped the mattress off the bed, gently moving Colleen to the floor behind the bed frame, first arranging the mattress as a barrier against the window. It would not stop a bullet, but it would block sight lines and absorb some of the tear gas if they lobbed a canister. He positioned himself against the wall beside the door, out of the line of fire from both the window and the entrance. He held the cig at his side. He breathed. "Time's up," Holcomb yelled from outside. The front window exploded inward. Glass rained across the room in a glittering shower, and a metal canister bounced off the dresser and rolled across the carpet, hissing white smoke. Tear gas. The room filled with it instantly, a choking chemical fog that burned the eyes and throat and lungs. Briggs had been gassed before in a standoff in Nevada 7 years ago, and he knew the drill. He pulled his shirt collar up over his nose and mouth. It was not a gas mask, but it filtered enough to keep him functional. He heard Rosie coughing in the bathroom, and his gut clenched, but the bathroom door was closed, and the tile room would contain some of the gas. She had the blankets. She would pull them over her face. She was smart. She would survive this. A booming impact hit the door. Once. Twice. They were kicking it in. The dresser slid back an inch with each blow. Briggs raised the cig and fired 2 rounds through the wood of the door, aiming high. He did not want to kill a cop, even a dirty cop. Killing a law enforcement officer was a line you could not uncross. It meant a manhunt. It meant federal charges. It meant spending the rest of your life in a cage or underground. He aimed above head height, punching 2 holes through the thin door that sent splinters flying outward into the misty afternoon. The kicking stopped. There was a scramble of boots on concrete as the men at the door retreated to cover behind their vehicles. "He is armed," a deputy screamed. "Active shooter." Then Holcomb's voice, sharp and final. "Light it up." The walls came apart. Bullets tore through the drywall as if it were wet paper. The room became a storm of plaster dust and wood chips and insulation fibers that danced in the air like snow. The sound was deafening, the continuous roar that obliterated thought and replaced it with pure animal instinct. Briggs dropped flat, covering Colleen's body with his own feeling, her frail frame beneath him, feeling the shallow rise and fall of her breathing against his chest. Something stung his left shoulder. Glass or a graze, he could not tell. The pain was bright and hot, but it faded quickly. Adrenaline was a powerful anesthetic. The shooting lasted 8 seconds. It felt like 8 hours. When it stopped, the room was unrecognizable. Daylight streamed through a dozen new holes in the walls. The dresser was splintered. The television was shattered. One of Rosie's crayon drawings, the one with the yellow sun and the stick figures holding hands, had a bullet hole through the center of it. Briggs checked himself. Shoulder wound superficial. He checked Colleen. Unconscious but breathing. The bed frame had stopped 2 rounds that would have hit her. He looked toward the bathroom. The door was still closed. No sound. Then faintly the sound of a child counting. 212. 213. She was counting. She was alive. She was doing exactly what he had told her to do. Briggs pressed his back against the wall and checked his magazine. 13 rounds left in this one. 15 in the spare. 28 shots between him and the end of everything. "Grizz, where are you?" he muttered through clenched teeth. And then he heard it. It began as a vibration, not in the air but in the floor. A low tremor that moved through the concrete foundation of the motel and up through the walls and into the soles of his boots. It was faint at first, barely perceptible beneath the ringing in his ears from the gunfire. But it grew. It grew the way thunder grows, starting as a whisper on the horizon and building to a roar that fills the sky from edge to edge. It was not one engine, it was not 5 engines or 10. It was a sound that could only be produced by dozens of V-twin motors, running open pipes unmuffled and unapologetic, a sound designed not for transportation, but for intimidation. It was the sound of the Redwood chapter of the Hellsangels motorcycle club arriving in force. They came around the corner of Route 7 like a wave. 50 motorcycles in tight V formation, chrome and steel, and black leather headlights cutting through the mist. They did not slow down at the parking lot entrance. They did not hesitate. They poured in like water through a broken dam, splitting into two columns that flowed around the police cruisers and the SUV and reformed behind them, encircling the vehicles completely. 50 engines killed simultaneously. The sudden silence was louder than the noise had been. 50 men swung off their bikes. They stood up. They did not draw weapons. They did not shout. They simply stood a wall of leather and denim and muscle and scars, forming a ring around the three police vehicles so tight that you could not have driven a bicycle between them. The shooting stopped the moment the first bikes appeared. The deputies had frozen in place, their rifles pointed at a room they had just shredded, their heads turning slowly as they realized they were surrounded. The blood drained from their faces in unison as if someone had pulled a collective plug. At the center of the formation, directly in front of the black SUV, stood Grizz Donovan. He was everything his name suggested and more. Wide as a refrigerator, arms like bridge cables, a beard the color of iron that hung to the middle of his chest. He wore his cut the way a general wears his stars, with the quiet authority of a man who does not need to raise his voice, because everyone already knows who he is. Beside him was Patch, a wiry man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather medical bag slung over one shoulder. The bag was military grade, packed with the kind of field trauma supplies that most emergency rooms would envy. Patch had been a Navy corpsman before he rode with the Angels. He had kept men alive on the deck of an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf. A motel room in Oregon was not going to beat him. Sheriff Holcomb stepped out of his SUV. His hand hovered near his sidearm, but it was a reflex, not a plan. He looked at the 50 bikers. He looked at his 5 deputies. The calculation in his eyes was visible. He was a man who survived by knowing the odds, and the odds had just turned catastrophic. Grizz walked forward. He did not hurry. He crossed the parking lot with the deliberate pace of a man walking to his own mailbox on a Sunday morning. He stopped 3 feet from Holcomb. The two men were approximately the same height, but Grizz was twice as wide, and the effect was that of a grizzly bear confronting a greyhound. Sheriff Grizz said. His voice was low, calm, and carried easily in the humid air. I believe you have one of ours inside that room. Holcomb straightened his spine. He was trying to regain authority, but his voice cracked on the first syllable. This is a crime scene. That man in there is a suspected kidnapper who opened fire on my deputies. That man in there, Grizz corrected without raising his voice, is my brother. And if he says he is helping a woman, then he is helping a woman. Now here is what is going to happen. We have a doctor with us. He is going to go inside that room and treat the patient. If she needs a hospital, we will escort her there, not you. Holcomb looked at the ring of bikers. He looked at his deputies who had lowered their rifles and were standing very still, the way prey animals stand still when a predator is nearby. You are obstructing justice, Holcomb said. The words came out thin and unconvincing, like the last air escaping from a punctured tire. We are ensuring it, Grizz replied. He turned his head and gestured toward room 9. Patch, get in there. Patch broke from the line and jogged across the parking lot, ducking through the splintered door frame. Inside, Briggs had already kicked the debris clear. The two men locked eyes. Patch looked at the bullet holes in the walls, the shattered glass, the tear gas residue still hanging in the air. Jesus Ironside, you look like you lost a fight with a building. The building started it, Briggs said. Patch was already on his knees beside Colleen. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had triaged wounds under worse conditions than this. His fingers found her pulse. Weak, fast, thready. He checked her pupils. Sluggish. He looked at the leg. His expression, which had been professionally neutral, tightened. She is shocky, Patch said. Blood pressure is in the basement. Temp is 104. The infection has gone systemic. He opened his bag and began pulling supplies with rapid precision. IV line, saline bag, a vial of broad-spectrum antibiotics, a dose of insulin from the club's emergency medical stash kept for a diabetic member named Wheeler who rode with the Redwood chapter. The IV went in clean. The saline started flowing. The antibiotics went in next, pushed directly into the line. Then the insulin carefully dosed. Patch worked for 5 minutes without speaking, his hands moving with a certainty that came from decades of keeping people alive who should have been dead. She is stable, Patch said finally, but only just. If we do not get her to an ICU in the next 20 minutes, the infection is going to shut down her organs one by one. Kidneys first, then liver, then everything else. The nearest real hospital is County General 40 miles east. That is outside this county's jurisdiction. That is the plan, Briggs said. He looked toward the bathroom. Rosie, it is safe now. You can come out. The bathroom door opened slowly. Rosie emerged, her eyes red and swollen from the gash, her face streaked with tears and dust. She looked at the destroyed room. She looked at Patch kneeling beside her mother with the IV line running. She looked at Briggs bleeding from his shoulder covered in plaster dust, and she did not cry. She had used up her tears. What was left was something harder. Is Mommy going to be okay? We are taking her to the hospital, Briggs said, right now. Rosie nodded. Then she said something that changed the course of the next 2 hours. Not yet, she said. Her voice was small but certain. Mommy said we have to tell people first. She said if we go to the hospital and nobody knows what happened, the bad men will find us there and nobody will stop them. She said the whole world has to know before we can be safe. Briggs stared at her. He had been planning to run straight to County General. Get Colleen into the ICU, put the USB drive in a federal agent's hands, let the system work. But this 7-year-old girl standing in a demolished motel room with gas-burned eyes was telling him that her mother had thought further ahead than he had. Colleen had understood something fundamental. Evidence that no one had seen was evidence that could disappear. A witness that no one knew about was a witness that could be silenced. But if the whole world was watching, if thousands of eyes were on you, then even a corrupt sheriff could not make you vanish. Sunlight was the only disinfectant that worked against this kind of rot. Where Briggs asked, the TV station, Rosie said. Mommy said there is a TV station in town. Channel 8. She said if we could get the drive to the news lady, it would be like turning on all the lights at once and the monsters would not be able to hide. Briggs looked at Patch. 20 minutes, Patch said. That is not a suggestion. That is a deadline. After 20 minutes, there is nothing I or anyone else can do. Briggs calculated. The WHV Channel 8 building was on the east side of downtown Oak Haven, maybe 8 minutes from here at speed. That left 12 minutes at the station before they had to be rolling toward County General. It was tight. It was insane. But the girl was right. Her mother was right. He walked out of the room into the humid afternoon. The standoff was still frozen. Grizz and Holcomb stood 10 feet apart, neither yielding ground. The deputies had clustered behind their cruisers. The bikers stood in their ring motionless, patient. Sheriff Briggs said, his voice carried across the parking lot. We are leaving. We are taking the woman and her daughter to get medical attention. You can follow if you want, but if you try to stop us. He paused. He let the silence fill in the rest. Holcomb's jaw worked. He looked at the bikers. He looked at the phones that had appeared in the hands of motel tenants peeking from distant rooms. He was being watched. He could not win a firefight here, not with 50 angels and civilian witnesses. Go, Holcomb hissed. But this is not over. You are harboring a fugitive and you assaulted an officer of the law. I will have warrants within the hour. We will let a judge sort that out, Briggs said. The bikers broke formation with practiced precision. Half of them mounted up and formed a corridor. Briggs carried Colleen from the room, cradling her against his chest the way you carry a sleeping child. She weighed almost nothing. The sickness had consumed her from the inside, leaving behind a shell of bones and fever and sheer stubborn will. He placed her in the back of the club's support van, a converted Ford Transit that Grizz used for long runs. Patch climbed in beside her, reconnecting the IV to a hook welded to the ceiling of the van. Rosie climbed in last. She sat on the floor of the van beside her mother and took Colleen's hand. She did not look back at the motel. She did not look at the room where she had lived for 5 months. There was nothing there worth looking at. Everything that mattered to her was in this van. Briggs mounted his Harley. The engine came alive beneath him, a sound that always steadied his nerves the way a heartbeat steadies a newborn. He keyed his radio headset. Grizz, change of plans. We are not going straight to the hospital. There was a pause. Where are we going? WHV Channel 8, east side of town. I have something the whole county needs to see. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Grizz's voice, carrying the resigned tone of a man who has followed his brothers into bad ideas before and knows he will do it again. Copy that. Lead the way. The convoy pulled out of the Starlight Motel at 1:32 in the afternoon. 50 Harley-Davidsons and one white Ford Transit van moving in tight formation down Route 7 toward downtown Oak Haven. The sound was enormous, a rolling thunder that rattled windows and set off car alarms and brought people to their doors and porches to stare with open mouths at the parade of leather and chrome and defiance. They had gone less than a mile when Briggs checked his mirrors. Holcomb was behind them. Not in his SUV, he had commandeered one of the deputy's cruisers and was following at a distance, lights flashing but sirens silent. Behind him, the other two vehicles fell into pursuit, and behind them at the edge of visibility, through the mist, more flashing lights. More cruisers. Company Briggs said into the radio, "Holcomb is tailing us, and he has called in reinforcements." Grizz's voice came back. "Rear guard report," a voice from the back of the formation. "State troopers, 4 cars, coming up fast on I-5 interchange. Looks like Holcomb called a 1099. 1099. Officer needs emergency assistance. All units respond." It was the nuclear option in law enforcement radio codes. It meant that every badge in a 50-mile radius was now converging on their location. And if Holcomb had told them a cop was down, the troopers would be coming in hot, expecting a firefight, primed to shoot first and ask questions after the funerals. "He lied to them," Briggs said. "He told them we killed a cop." "Then we need to not look like cop killers," Grizz replied. "Phalanx formation, slow and steady. Nobody draws a weapon. Nobody makes a move that could be interpreted as hostile. We ride like a funeral procession, and we let the cameras do the fighting." The formation shifted. The bikers at the rear spread across all 3 lanes of the highway, creating a moving wall of steel and leather that blocked the pursuing vehicles. They dropped their speed to 55, perfectly legal, perfectly infuriating. The state troopers tried to weave through. A biker named Cutter, 310 pounds of Missouri farm boy on an custom road king, simply drifted into whatever lane the troopers tried to use, blocking them with the casual indifference of a boulder in a stream. The lead trooper leaned on his horn. Cutter did not flinch. He rode on, eyes forward, hands steady on the handlebars, as immovable as the laws of physics. "Suspects are obstructing traffic," the trooper shouted into his radio, requesting permission to perform a pursuit intervention maneuver. "Negative," the dispatcher came back. "Too many vehicles, too many targets. Do not engage at high speed. Maintain pursuit and wait for additional units." Briggs saw the exit sign for downtown Oak Haven, 2 miles. He keyed the radio. "Exit 4, straight to the WHV building." But as they neared the off-ramp, a black pickup truck appeared on the on-ramp coming from the opposite direction. It was Holcomb. He had peeled away from the pursuit, taken back roads that only a local would know, and circled ahead to cut them off. The truck roared onto the highway directly in front of the convoy tires, smoking on the wet asphalt. Holcomb brake-checked them, his heavy rear bumper suddenly inches from Briggs's front tire. "He is trying to cause a wreck," Rosie screamed from inside the van. She was pressed against the windshield, watching everything, and her voice came through the radio because the van's driver had his headset on open channel. "Hold on," the driver of the van yelled, slamming the brakes. The van fishtailed on the wet road, the rear end swinging wide before the tires found grip. Patch threw himself over Colleen's body to keep her from sliding off the bench. Briggs reacted on instinct. 30 years of riding 100,000 miles of highway, every near miss and close call and crash had programmed his muscles to respond faster than thought. He did not brake. He throttled up. The Harley surged forward, swerving right around Holcomb's bumper, and pulled up alongside the driver's window of the truck. Through the glass, he could see Holcomb's face. It was twisted beyond recognition. The smooth politician's mask was gone, replaced by something feral and desperate. The face of a man watching his empire crumble and willing to kill to stop it. His hands wrestled with the steering wheel, jerking it toward Briggs, trying to push the motorcycle off the road and under the wheels of the 18-wheeler in the oncoming lane. Briggs kicked the side of the truck. His heavy boot connected with the door panel with a clang that was lost in the roar of engines. It was a futile gesture against 2 tons of steel, but the message was clear. "I am here. I am not leaving. You will have to kill me in front of everyone." "Tank the van," Briggs yelled. Grizz saw the opening. He throttled up from behind and pulled alongside the truck's right side. Now Holcomb was boxed in a motorcycle on each flank, unable to swerve without hitting one of them and sending all 3 vehicles into a catastrophic collision. 3 more bikers pulled in front of the truck and began to decelerate. Holcomb could not accelerate through them without creating a pileup that would kill him along with everyone else. The truck slowed. The van shot past, taking the exit ramp at 60 miles per hour. The driver fought the wheel as two tires lifted off the ground, the van leaning sickeningly before slamming back down on all four wheels with a jolt that rattled every bolt in the frame. Go, 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 Briggs shouted. He peeled away from the truck and followed the van down the ramp, leaning into the curve so hard his knee nearly scraped the pavement. Behind him, the main pack of angels held position on the highway for 10 more seconds, keeping Holcomb and the troopers locked in a slow-moving cage. Then, as if controlled by a single mind, all 50 bikes peeled off onto the exit ramp in a synchronized wave of sound and motion that would have been beautiful if it had not been so terrifying. By the time Holcomb freed himself from the highway and reached the exit, the angels were already deep into the streets of Oak Haven. They blew through red lights. They scattered through intersections. Pedestrians on the sidewalks froze in place, phones out recording the impossible sight of a biker army escorting a white van through their quiet little town like a military convoy protecting a head of state. The WHV Channel 8 building appeared ahead, a three-story brick structure with a satellite dish on the roof and a small parking lot in front. It was not an impressive building. It was the kind of local station that covered county fairs and high school football and weather reports that everyone already knew because they could look out the window. But it had a broadcast tower, and it had a signal that reached 50,000 homes in the Tri-County area, and right now that was worth more than every weapon in every biker's saddlebag. Here Briggs called out, "Secure the perimeter. Nobody gets inside without a cut." The bikes swarmed the parking lot. They filled every space line, the curbs blocked the entrance. Briggs was off his machine before the engine died. He ran to the back of the van and threw open the doors. Patch was performing chest compressions. His glasses were fogged. His arms pumped rhythmically, pressing down on Colleen's sternum, with the heel of his palm counting under his breath. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. "I lost her pulse," Patch shouted without looking up. She coded in the van, the jolt from the ramp. It stopped her heart. "I have been working on her for 90 seconds. She is not responding." Briggs looked at Rosie. She was sitting on the floor of the van, her mother's hands still in hers, staring at Colleen's gray face bouncing with each compression. She was not crying. She was not screaming. She was somewhere beyond those things, in a place where the world had become very quiet and very clear. The way it becomes when the worst thing you ever imagined starts happening in front of you. "Keep working," Briggs said to Patch. "Do not stop." He reached into the van and scooped Rosie up with one arm, settling her against his hip. She was light, so light. She weighed nothing. She held onto his vest with both hands. Briggs ran. He hit the glass doors of the lobby at full speed, slamming them open with his shoulder. A young man behind the reception desk, whose name tag read Gary, dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the tile floor. He stared at the giant in the leather vest carrying a small girl, followed by a medic performing CPR on a woman being wheeled in on a gurney improvised from the van's fold-down bench, surrounded by a phalanx of bikers who looked like they had ridden straight out of a war zone. "Where is the studio?" Briggs barked. The sound of his voice bounced off the walls of the small lobby like a cannon shot. Gary pointed with a trembling finger. "Down the hall. Studio B. They are live right now. Do not call the police," Briggs said as he ran past. "They are already outside." He hit the double doors marked "On Air." They flew open and banged against the walls on either side. Inside, the studio was smaller than it looked on television. A single camera on a dolly, a desk with 2 chairs, a monitor showing the live feed, ring lights and boom microphones hanging from the ceiling. And behind the desk mid-sentence, in a segment about the upcoming county agricultural fair, sat Nora Sinclair. Nora was 61 years old and had been in broadcast journalism for 33 of them. She had started at a station in Boise, moved to Portland, and ended up in Oak Haven after a divorce and a buyout, and the slow realization that the big stories had passed her by. She was known for her puff pieces. She was known for her steady voice and her sensible blazers and her refusal to make waves. She had not broken a real story in 15 years. She stopped talking when the doors opened. The camera swiveled on instinct, the operator tracking the movement. The floor director, a young woman with a headset and a clipboard, screamed, "Cut the feed! Cut the feed! Keep it rolling!" Briggs shouted. He was on the set now, standing on the raised platform under the hot lights, and he looked like something from a nightmare. Wet, filthy, a smear of blood on his shoulder, plaster dust in his beard. His sunglasses gone, his pale blue eyes burning with an intensity that the camera could not look away from. He set Rosie down on the anchor's desk. She sat there among the papers and the coffee mug and the monitor, her pink raincoat torn, her face smudged with tear gas residue, and dirt, her wet straw hair hanging in her eyes. Behind them, Patch and two other bikers brought Colleen in. They laid her on the studio floor. Patch resumed compressions immediately. The rhythmic thud of his palms against her chest filled the studio like a metronome counting down the seconds she had left. The red-on-air light on the camera was still glowing. The technical director in the control booth, a 22-year-old kid named Marcus, who had grown up despising authority and had taken this job only because it was the sole opening in town, had not cut the signal. He sat at his console with his finger hovering over the kill switch and made a choice. He left it on. Nora Sinclair stood up from her chair. She looked at Briggs. She looked at the dying woman on her studio floor. She looked at the little girl sitting on her desk. She looked at the camera. "Who are you?" she asked. "You cannot be in here." Briggs reached into his vest and pulled out the USB drive with the plastic unicorn keychain. He placed it on the desk beside Rosie. "My name is Briggs Calloway," he said, "and this is Rosie, and that woman on your floor is her mother, Colleen, and you are going to help us save her life." He pointed at the USB drive. "Sheriff Holcomb runs a drug trafficking operation through the lumberyard on Route 7. He murdered this girl's father because he found out. He has been hunting her mother because she has the proof. This drive has the ledgers, the bank transfers, the audio recordings, everything." Nora stared at the unicorn keychain. She stared at the drive. She could hear the compressions behind her, the desperate rhythm of Patch trying to restart a woman's heart. She could hear Rosie breathing beside her, quick and shallow. And she could hear distantly the sound of sirens approaching the building. She looked at the camera. The red light stared back. 33 years of playing it safe. 33 years of county fairs and weather reports and stories that mattered to no one. 33 years of wondering what she might have been if she had ever had the courage to chase the truth instead of running from it. Nora Sinclair sat back down in her chair. She straightened her blazer. She looked into the lens. "Prove it," she said. "Plug it in." Outside, tires screeched in the parking lot, doors slammed. Holcomb had arrived, and he had not come alone. Rosie picked up the USB drive. Her small fingers found the cap and pulled it off. She held it out to Nora. "This is what my mommy died to protect," Rosie said. Her voice was clear and steady, and it carried across the studio and through the microphones and out over the airwaves into 50,000 homes where people were eating lunch and folding laundry and living ordinary lives that were about to be interrupted by the extraordinary courage of a 7-year-old girl. Nora took the drive. She plugged it into the studio laptop, and on the monitor, the first file opened. An audio recording, labeled Cleanup, March 12th. She hit play. The audio played through the studio monitors, and it was as clear as a church bell ringing in an empty valley. There was no static, no distortion. Colleen Mercer had been a meticulous bookkeeper, and she had recorded her evidence with the same precision she had once used to balance the county's ledgers. Every word was crisp. Every syllable was damning. "And make it look like an accident." The voice was unmistakable. It belonged to a man who had spent 20 years speaking into microphones at press conferences and town hall meetings, a voice that every person in the Tri-County area had heard 100 times on their televisions and radios. It was the voice of Sheriff Wade Holcomb. "Cut the brake lines on the truck. If the wife asks questions, threaten the kid. I do not care if you have to burn the house down. No loose ends." A second voice responded, thinner, nervous. "And what about the money from the shipment? Launder it through the motel rentals. Vance handles that. He takes his cut and moves the rest through the lumberyard accounts. Just get it done. I have a council meeting at 6. The recording lasted 43 seconds. In those 43 seconds, the entire mythology of Oak Haven, the quiet timber town, the safe community, the place where people left their doors unlocked, crumbled like a sandcastle hit by a wave. 43 seconds was all it took to destroy a man who had spent 2 decades building a fortress of lies. Nora Sinclair sat rigid behind the anchor desk. Her hand was pressed against her mouth. Her eyes were wide, and in them was something Briggs recognized. It was the look of someone who had just realized that everything they believed about the world they lived in was wrong. Every handshake at a county barbecue, every smile at a fundraiser, every reassuring press conference after a drug bust that was nothing more than theater. All of it. Lies. The studio was silent except for the rhythmic thud of Patch's compressions on Colleen's chest. That sound had become the heartbeat of the room, steady and relentless, a refusal to let death have the final word. Rosie sat on the anchor desk with her legs dangling over the edge. She was watching the monitor where the audio file's waveform pulsed with each word from Holcomb's recorded voice. She did not look surprised. She had heard these recordings before. Her mother had played them for her in the motel room late at night with the volume low, explaining in the simplest terms she could what the words meant and why they mattered. Mommy made the bad man talk when he did not know she was listening. And now everyone gets to hear. Nora opened the second file. It was a spreadsheet. Columns of numbers stretching back 3 years. Dates, amounts, account numbers, names. The financial skeleton of a criminal enterprise laid bare in rows and cells. Deposits that matched to the penny with the dates of timber shipments arriving at the Route 7 lumberyard. Withdrawals routed through the Starlight Motel's rental accounts. Payments to county officials, deputies, building inspectors, a judge. The corruption was not a single thread. It was the entire fabric. Nora began to read aloud. Her voice had found that professional steel, the tone she had cultivated over 3 decades of broadcasting, the voice that conveyed authority and calm even when the world was burning. She read the dates and the amounts. She read the names. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Outside the studio, the building shook, not from an earthquake, from boots, heavy boots, many of them pounding down the hallway toward the studio doors. A voice boomed through the corridor, amplified by rage and desperation. Barricade Briggs said, Grizz and three. Barricade Briggs said, Grizz and 3 other bikers slammed the heavy soundproof studio door shut. They piled equipment cases against them. Road cases for cameras, lighting rigs, a dolly loaded with sandbags. The doors were thick, designed to keep sound out, and now they would serve to keep something far more dangerous at bay. The battering started immediately. Not fists, something heavier. A ram. The door shuddered with each impact, the frame cracking, dust falling from the ceiling tiles above. But the equipment held. For now. Nora kept reading. Her voice never wavered. She was a journalist, and this was the story she had waited 33 years to tell, and she would tell it if the roof came down around her. May 4th. Payment received from cartel intermediary. $200,000, deposited through 3 separate shell accounts registered to the lumberyard, authorized by G. Holcomb. June 10th, directive issued to suppress investigation into overdose deaths in the Millfield district. Coroner reports altered. Cause of death changed from opioid toxicity to cardiac event. Signed off by Sheriff Holcomb. August 2nd. Order to eliminate witness. Target Emmett Mercer. Method vehicle sabotage. Brake line severance on 1998 Ford F-150. Executed August 3rd. That last entry hung in the air like smoke. August 3rd, the day Rosie's father died. The day a truck went off a mountain road and everyone said what a terrible accident, and the sheriff stood at the memorial service and shook Colleen's hand and told her how sorry he was. The studio doors cracked. A gap appeared at the top, wide enough to see flashlight beams sweeping through the hallway. Holcomb was close. His SWAT team was close. The heavy equipment cases shifted an inch with each blow. Then the power went out. It did not flicker. It did not fade. It died. One moment the studio was lit by the hot white glare of the ring lights, in the glow of the monitors, and the red pulse of the on-air indicator. The next moment, darkness. Total, complete, suffocating darkness. The monitors went black. The cameras lost power. The broadcast signal, which had been streaming into 50,000 homes, vanished mid-sentence. Nora's voice cut off as if someone had pressed a hand over her mouth. Someone found the junction box, Grizz said in the dark. They killed the main power. We lost the feed, Marcus shouted from the control booth. His voice cracked. Transmission is dead. We are off the air. Silence. Or not silence exactly, because the battering at the door continued, and Patch's compressions continued, and somewhere in the dark, Rosie was breathing in quick, shallow gasps. But the silence of the broadcast. The silence of the truth being smothered. Briggs stood in the darkness and felt the weight of it. He had played his hand. He had brought the evidence to the one place that could amplify it to the world, and the world had been listening, and then someone had pulled the plug. 10 seconds of audio and a few lines from a spreadsheet. Not enough. Holcomb's lawyers would call it a deep fake. They would say the audio was fabricated by a criminal biker gang with a grudge. They would bury it in motions and counterclaims in expert witnesses who would testify that modern technology could make anyone's voice say anything. The recording alone, without the full context of the documents, without the ledger being read in its entirety, was not enough to convict. It was enough to create doubt, and doubt was all Holcomb needed. Did it go out? Briggs asked in the dark. His voice was flat, controlled. But beneath the control was something that felt unfamiliar. It felt like despair. Maybe 10 seconds of the audio, Nora whispered from somewhere to his left, and 2 minutes of the ledger. Not enough. They will spin it. They will say it was fabricated. Without the full document being read and verified on air, it is just noise. Rosie's voice came from the desktop where she was still sitting. Small, clear, piercing through the dark with the simplicity that only a child's logic can achieve. Use the phones. Briggs turned toward the sound of her voice. What Mommy said, if the TV turns off, use the internet. She said the internet never turns off. She said everyone has a phone now, and every phone is a TV station. Briggs stood very still. He thought about what Colleen had told her daughter. He thought about the depth of planning that had gone into this, the layers of contingency that a dying woman had built into her escape plan. Television was plan A. The internet was plan B. And a 7-year-old girl was the one who remembered the backup when the adults in the room had frozen. Briggs said, "How many followers does the club page have nationally?" "About 200,000, Grizz replied. "Why, everyone with a phone. Right now, every single one of you. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever you have, go live. Point your cameras at the evidence. Point them at the door they are breaking down. Point them at the sheriff when he comes through." Grizz did not hesitate. He keyed his radio. "All hands, phones out. Go live on everything, stream it all. This goes worldwide, or it does not go at all." In the darkness of the studio, 12 cell phone flashlights clicked on. Then 12 more from the bikers in the hallway and the lobby and the parking lot. The effect was strange and beautiful, like stars appearing in a sky that had been black a moment before. The harsh white light of the phone screens illuminated faces as leather. The desk, Nora's blazer, Rosie's pink raincoat, and Colleen's gray face on the floor where Patch still worked. Then the live notifications started. 12 phones simultaneously began broadcasting. The pings came in rapid succession, each one a doorway opening between this dark studio and the connected world outside. Comments began scrolling immediately. Viewers appeared. 10, 50, 300, 1,000. The number climbed with the speed of a fire catching in dry brush. Nora Briggs said. He handed her the studio laptop, which was running on its internal battery. The screen cast a blue glow across her face. "Read the ledger. Read it to the world. All of it." Nora Sinclair looked at the laptop. She looked at the phones pointed at her. She could see herself reflected in a dozen screens, her face lit from below by the laptop's glow, surrounded by bikers and Cal and a dying woman and a child who had been braver than anyone Nora had ever interviewed in 33 years of journalism. She straightened her blazer one more time. She brushed a strand of hair from her face. She looked into the nearest phone camera with the same steady gaze she had perfected over 3 decades of looking into lenses. This is Nora Sinclair reporting live from the studios of WHV Channel 8 in Oak Haven, Oregon. Our broadcast signal has been cut by order of Sheriff Wade Holcomb, who is currently attempting to breach the studio with an armed tactical team. But we are not silent. I am holding documents that prove a conspiracy of murder, drug trafficking, and racketeering at the highest levels of this county's law enforcement. These documents were gathered at enormous personal risk by Colleen Mercer, a former county bookkeeper whose husband was murdered for discovering the truth. I will now read these documents in their entirety. The world is watching. She began to read. The battering at the door intensified. The crack widened. Through the gap, flashlight beams cut into the studio like searchlights. Voices shouted. Commands overlapped. The chaos of armed men trying to force entry into a room that did not want to open. September 15th, Nora read, her voice steady as a metronome. Shipment 47. Contents, 200 kilograms of fentanyl precursor chemicals concealed within hollow Douglas fir logs. Origin, Port of Oakland. Destination Route 7, Lumberyard, Oak Haven. Distribution handled by Deputies Fenton and Kearns under direct supervision of Sheriff Holcomb. Street value estimated $3.2 million. The numbers rolled out of her mouth like an indictment read aloud in a courtroom. Each entry was a nail in a coffin. Each date was a crime. Each name was a life that would be destroyed when the sun came up tomorrow and the lawyers arrived. The door gave way. It happened with a sound like a tree falling. The frame splintered. The equipment cases tumbled. Flashlight beams and the red dots of laser sights swept into the room, painting the walls and the floor and the faces of everyone inside with points of crimson light. "Get on the ground," a voice screamed. Everybody on the ground now. Armed men poured through the opening. 5 of them in tactical gear, helmets, vests, rifles up. Behind them, pushing through like a man possessed, came Sheriff Wade Holcomb. He was not wearing his campaign face anymore. His silver hair was disheveled. His uniform was rumpled. His eyes were wide and wild, the eyes of a cornered animal that has realized the trap has closed and the only option left is to bite. He saw Nora. He saw the laptop. He saw the phones, a dozen glowing rectangles pointed at him like the eyes of witnesses he could not intimidate or silence or kill. "Drop it," Holcomb shrieked. He raised his sidearm, not at Briggs, not at the bikers, at the laptop, or perhaps at Nora. In the chaos and the flashlight glare and the adrenaline, it was impossible to tell, and perhaps Holcomb himself did not know. He was beyond strategy. He was beyond calculation. He was a man watching his life dissolve in real time on screens he could not turn off. "Do not do it, Holcomb." Briggs stepped forward. He had dropped his gun somewhere in the last few minutes, or perhaps he had tucked it away, knowing that a weapon in his hand would give the SWAT team reason to shoot. His hands were up, empty, open. But his body was between Holcomb and the desk where Nora sat, and his body was a considerable obstacle. "Look at the phones," Briggs said. His voice was calm, eerily calm. The calm of a man who has passed through fear and come out the other side into a place where nothing matters except the next 3 seconds. "You are live right now. 50 streams, 100,000 viewers. The whole world is watching you point a gun at a journalist. Put it down." Holcomb's gun hand trembled. He scanned the room. Every biker was holding a phone. Every screen was broadcasting. The comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur, but fragments were visible. "Is that the sheriff? He has a gun. Someone call the FBI. I am recording this." "Oh my God, is that a little girl?" Holcomb's arm dropped an inch, then another. The realization was dawning slow and terrible, like sunrise on a battlefield where you have lost. He could not shoot his way out of this. He could not threaten his way out. He could not cut the power to the internet. He could not silence 100,000 voices that were already screaming. Then the sound that had been the constant rhythm of the room, the sound that had been the only heartbeat holding this moment together, stopped. Patch's hands went still on Colleen's chest. He sat back on his heels. His glasses were fogged. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His face carried the expression that medical professionals develop over years of losing patience, a mask of professional composure stretched thin over a grief that never gets easier. "She is gone," Patch said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the sudden stillness. "Briggs," she stopped breathing. "I cannot get her back." The words fell into the room like stones into a well. They sank through the chaos and the shouting and the flashlight beams and the live streams, and they hit the bottom with a sound that everyone heard, even though it made no noise at all. Briggs turned away from Holcomb. He turned away from the guns and the cameras and the tactical team. He walked to where Colleen lay on the studio floor, and he dropped to his knees beside her. The impact of his knees hitting the tile cracked one of the floor tiles in half. "No," Briggs whispered. He placed his hands on her chest. His massive scarred hands, the hands that had broken bones and bent steel, and snapped a baseball bat like a twig pressed down on the fragile ribs of a woman who weighed 110 pounds. He began compressions. He was not gentle. He could not afford to be. He felt a rib crack under the pressure, and he did not stop. He pressed harder. "Come on," he growled. "You do not get to quit. You have a kid. You have a plan. The plan is not done. Breathe." He compressed again, and again, and again. Each push was an act of will, a refusal to accept the silence where her heartbeat should have been. Rosie slid off the desk. She did not make a sound. She landed on her feet with the soft thud of wet sneakers on tile, and she stood there for a moment looking at her mother's face. Colleen's eyes were closed. Her skin was the color of candle wax. She looked peaceful, which was the cruelest thing about death, the way it mimicked sleep, the way it tricked you into thinking that any second now, the person would take a breath and open their eyes and tell you it was all going to be okay. Rosie did not go to her mother. She turned. She walked across the studio floor, past the overturned equipment, past the bikers with their phones, past Nora Sinclair, who had stopped reading and was pressing her hand over her mouth. Rosie walked straight toward Sheriff Wade Holcomb. He was still standing in the breach of the broken doorway. His gun was at his side, now hanging loose in a hand that had forgotten it was holding it. His tactical team had frozen in place. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Every phone in the room tracked the small figure in the pink raincoat as she crossed the floor. She stopped in front of him. The top of her head came to just above his belt. She had to tilt her head back to look at his face the same way she had tilted it back to look at Briggs in the diner that morning a lifetime ago. And then she hit him. Her small fist connected with his thigh. It could not have hurt. She was 7 years old and weighed 50 pounds, and her fist was the size of a tennis ball. But the sound it made, the soft thump of a child's hand against the uniform of the man who had killed her father and hunted her mother and tried to erase her entire family from the earth, was the loudest sound in the room. She hit him again and again. Each blow was accompanied by a word torn from her chest in a voice that cracked and broke and reformed and broke again. You killed my daddy. She pounded her fists against his leg. You hurt my mommy. She was crying now. The tears she had held back all day through the diner and the motel and the gunfire and the car chase and the dark studio, all of them came at once, a flood that blurred her eyes and choked her words, but did not stop her fists. You are a monster. You are the worst person in the whole world. And I hate you. I hate you. She hit him one more time with everything she had, and then she grabbed his uniform pants with both hands and looked up at him through her tears and said the words that broke him. Save her. You can save her. Tell the doctors to come, please. You have all the power. Use it for something good. Just once, please. Holcomb looked down at the girl. He looked at her wet hair and her torn pink raincoat, and her face streaked with tears and chemical residue and dirt. He looked at her eyes, which were her father's eyes. Emmett Mercer's eyes, the eyes of the man he had ordered killed on a mountain road 18 months ago. He looked at those eyes, and whatever was left of the man he had been before the money and the power and the corruption ate him from the inside out, whatever small piece of Wade Holcomb still remembered. What it meant to be human, that piece surfaced for the first and last time. His gun clattered to the floor. The sound echoed through the studio like a period at the end of a sentence. Paramedics, Holcomb said. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw, barely recognizable as the smooth baritone that had commanded this county for 2 decades. He turned to his deputies in the hallway. Get the paramedics in here. Now. Right now. Move. It was the first honest order he had given in years. Perhaps the first honest words he had spoken in longer than that. And they came not from strategy or self-preservation or political calculation. They came from a 7-year-old girl's fist against his leg and the look in her dead father's eyes staring up at him from her living face. The tactical team parted. 2 paramedics who had been held in the lobby rushed through the gap, pushing a gurney loaded with equipment. They dropped beside Colleen. Patch moved aside, giving them room, his face gray with exhaustion. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s with steady hands and a no-nonsense expression, assessed the situation in 3 seconds. She pulled the defibrillator from the gurney and placed the pads on Colleen's chest. Clear, she called. Everyone stepped back. Briggs pulled his hands away. Rosie was lifted off her feet by Grizz, who held her against his chest like she was made of glass. The defibrillator whined as it charged. The sound climbed in pitch, a mechanical scream building toward release. Thump! Colleen's body jerked. Her back arched off the tile floor to a floor and then fell back. The paramedic looked at the monitor. A flat line skated across the screen, green and horizontal and merciless. No rhythm, she said. Charging again. The whine built again. Higher, longer. The seconds stretched like taffy. Clear. Thump. Colleen's body jerked again. And this time on the monitor, the flat line stuttered. It dipped. It spiked. It dipped again. And then fragile as a spider's thread, a rhythm emerged. Weak, irregular, but there. A heartbeat, a life refusing to let go. We have a pulse, the paramedic said. She exhaled, and the exhale carried the weight of a career's worth of moments just like this one. Faint but present. We need to move. Now, they loaded Colleen onto the gurney. The IV was reconnected. An oxygen mask was placed over her nose and mouth. Rosie reached out from Griz's arms and touched her mother's hand as the gurney rolled past. Colleen's fingers twitched. The smallest movement, the barest acknowledgement. But Rosie felt it, and her face changed. The despair cracked, and through the crack, something else pushed through. Not hope exactly, something older than hope. Certainty. The certainty of a child who has been told by her mother that everything will be okay, and who still, despite everything, believes it. They wheeled Colleen out of the studio, down the hallway, past the shattered doors into the lobby, and out into the afternoon where an ambulance was waiting with its lights flashing and its back doors open. The paramedics loaded her in and the door slammed, and the ambulance pulled away, siren screaming, heading east toward County General Hospital, 40 miles away, and outside the jurisdiction of every corrupt official in Oak Haven. Briggs stood in the center of the destroyed studio. He watched the ambulance lights disappear through the lobby windows. His shoulder was bleeding. His hands were shaking. The adrenaline that had sustained him for the past 6 hours was draining out of him like water from a cracked vessel, and what it left behind was a tiredness so profound that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on his bones. Holcomb had not moved from the doorway. He stood there empty-handed, staring at nothing. The fight had gone out of him so completely that he looked like a different person, a smaller person, as if the authority and the menace had been a suit of armor that had fallen away and left behind nothing but a tired old man in a wrinkled uniform. A new figure entered the studio. He was tall, lean, wearing the gray uniform of the Oregon State Police, captain's bars on his collar, a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then left out in the weather for 40 years. He walked with the deliberate stride of a man who had watched the entire sequence of events unfold on a live stream from his cruiser in the parking lot and had already made several phone calls to people who outranked everyone in this room. He walked up to Holcomb. He stopped directly in front of him. He reached to his own belt and unclipped a pair of handcuffs. "Sheriff Holcomb," the captain said. His voice was quiet and grim and carried the weight of the law. The real law, the kind that did not answer to small-town politics or lumberyard money or men with baseball bats. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." He turned Holcomb around and clicked the cuffs into place. Holcomb did not resist. He did not speak. He walked out of the studio between two state troopers with his head down and his silver hair hanging over his face, and the phones followed him every step of the way, streaming his perp walk to an audience that had grown to over 300,000 viewers across a dozen platforms. Briggs watched him go. He felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, no relief. He felt the absence of things the way you feel the absence of pain after a long illness, not as pleasure but as emptiness, a void where something terrible used to live. He looked around the studio. Grizz was still holding Rosie. Patch was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, eyes closed, his bloody hands resting on his knees. Nora Sinclair was still at the desk, the laptop still open, the USB drive still plugged in the unicorn keychain dangling over the edge like a small plastic sentinel guarding the truth. Nora looked at Briggs. There were tears on her face, but her jaw was set and her eyes were clear. "I want to read the rest of it," she said. "All of it. On air. As soon as we get power back." Briggs nodded. Then he walked to Grizz and held out his arms. Grizz transferred Rosie to him, and Briggs held her the way he had not held a child in 5 years. Close against his chest, her head tucked under his chin, her small body fitting into the space between his arms, as if it had been designed to go there. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" Rosie asked. Her voice was muffled against his vest. "She is a fighter," Briggs said. "Just like you." Rosie was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that landed in Briggs's chest like a fist. "You are a good person, Mr. Briggs. I knew it when I saw you. Mommy was right. She is always right." Briggs closed his eyes. He held the girl tighter, and for the first time in more years than he could count, he felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom behind his ribs, in the space where he had assumed nothing lived anymore. 6 months later, spring came to Oak Haven. It came the way spring always comes to the Pacific Northwest, suddenly and without apology. One week the hills were gray and the rain was relentless, and the sky looked like a ceiling made of concrete. The next week, the dogwoods bloomed. The creeks ran clear, the air smelled of pine and fresh earth, and the particular sweetness of a world waking up after a long sleep. Oak Haven looked different. Not just because of the season, the changes were structural, fundamental, the kind of changes that happen when you pull a tumor out of a living body and the body against all odds begins to heal. Sheriff Wade Holcomb was in federal custody, awaiting trial on 37 counts, including drug trafficking, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. Vance Pruitt had turned state's witness within 48 hours of his arrest, trading everything he knew for a reduced sentence. 4 deputies were indicted. The county judge who had signed off on the altered coroner's reports resigned and then was arrested trying to board a flight to Mexico City. The lumberyard on Route 7 was seized by the DEA. The Starlight Motel was condemned and demolished. The story, propelled by those initial live streams that reached 300,000 viewers in real time, had gone national within hours. The footage of Rosie confronting Holcomb, her small fists against his uniform, her voice breaking as she begged him to save her mother, was viewed 11 million times in the first week. News crews from Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, and eventually New York descended on Oak Haven like migratory birds following a signal. Nora Sinclair's full reading of the Mercer documents, broadcast the following day on a restored WHV signal and simultaneously streamed on every platform, became the foundational evidence for the federal case. Nora received a call from the Pulitzer Committee. She did not take it right away. She was busy. She had a newsroom to rebuild. Colleen Mercer survived. The surgeons at County General Hospital operated for 9 hours. They debrided the infected tissue from her leg, pumped her full of the most aggressive antibiotics available, and stabilized her blood sugar with an insulin regimen that would require monitoring for the rest of her life. She spent 3 weeks in the ICU. She spent another month in recovery. She lost feeling in 2 toes on her right foot, a permanent reminder of how close the sepsis had come to taking her leg and then the rest of her. But she walked out of that hospital on her own 2 feet, holding Rosie's hand, into a spring afternoon that smelled like possibility. They did not go back to Oak Haven immediately. A victims advocacy group arranged temporary housing in Eugene. Colleen received a settlement from the county, not large but enough. Enough to breathe, enough to stop running. Enough to look at a calendar and think about next month, next year. A future concepts that had been luxuries she could not afford for 18 months. It was Colleen's decision to go back. She told Rosie first. Then she told Briggs during one of his weekly phone calls. Calls that had started as check-ins and had become something else. Something that neither of them had a word for, because the word friend did not quite cover what happens when someone guards your unconscious body with a knife and a promise and a crumpled dollar bill. She went back to Oak Haven because it was her town. It was where Emmett was buried. It was where Rosie had been born. It was where the fear had lived, and she was done letting fear choose her address. The Rusty Spoon Diner was for sale. The previous owner, an elderly man named Clifford, who had been running the place since before Colleen was born, wanted to retire. He had watched the live stream. He had seen Colleen on his studio floor. He sold her the diner for $1. $1. The symmetry was not lost on anyone. Colleen gutted the place. She scrubbed the floors. She replaced the ceiling tiles. She bought new booths with her settlement money. She kept the name because the name was honest, and Oak Haven needed honesty more than it needed polish. She hired Lorraine back at a raise and gave her health insurance for the first time in 11 years. She put a help wanted sign in the window, and half the town applied. She managed the diner the way she had managed the county books, with precision and care and an attention to detail that made everything she touched run better. She balanced the accounts herself. She ordered the supplies herself. She mopped the floor at closing time herself. Nobody rescued her from this life. She built it with her own 2 hands, the same hands that had once copied secret files onto a unicorn keychain, USB drive in a darkened county office, while the man who murdered her husband sat in the next room. On a Tuesday morning in late April, 6 months to the day after the siege at WHUP Channel 8, the sound of motorcycles returned to Oak Haven. This time, nobody hid. Grady Phelps, the mechanic, looked up from the engine he was working on and grinned. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the edge of the sidewalk to watch. Lorraine stepped out of the rusty spoon and shielded her eyes against the spring sun. Neighbors came to their porches, children pointed. A woman waved from the window of the hardware store. 20 Harley-Davidsons rolled down Main Street in loose formation, engines, rumbling chrome catching the light. At the head of the column rode Briggs Calloway. He looked the same. Scarred, bearded, massive, wearing his cut like a second skin. His sunglasses hid his eyes. His expression was unreadable. But something was different. Something in the way he rode. Something in the set of his shoulders. The weight that had been there 6 months ago, the weight of a man carrying years of failure and silence and regret, had shifted. It was not gone. Weight like that does not disappear. But it had been redistributed, balanced by something new. And the bike moved beneath him with an ease that spoke of a man who was for the first time in a long time riding towards something instead of away from it. He pulled into the parking lot of the Rusty Spoon and killed the engine. The rest of the chapter filed in behind him, filling the lot with bikes. Grizz was there. Patch was there. Cutter, the big Missouri farm boy, was there. Briggs dismounted and walked through the new glass door of the diner. The bell above it chimed. The sound was bright and clean, a new bell for a new chapter. The inside of the Rusty Spoon was transformed. Same bones, same layout, same counter with the same stools. But the ceiling was white. The floor was clean. The booths were new, upholstered in deep red vinyl. The air smelled of fresh coffee and bacon, and something baking in the back, cinnamon rolls, maybe something sweet and warm. And at the corner booth table, for the same table where Briggs had sat 6 months ago, nursing a cold coffee and a colder heart, sat Rosie Mercer. She was coloring, a thick book of mandalas, the kind with intricate patterns that required focus and patience. She was using crayons, the good kind, the 64-pack with the sharpener built into the box. Her hair was clean and combed and caught the light from the window. She was wearing a new dress, blue with white flowers. Her sneakers were new. She looked like a different child, and she was a different child in all the ways that mattered, though her eyes still held that quality of knowing too much for someone her age, and probably always would. She looked up. She saw Briggs, and the coloring book went flying. "Mr. Briggs," she screamed, launching herself from the booth with a velocity that would have impressed a track coach. She crossed the diner in 4 seconds and hit him at full speed, wrapping her arms around his legs with a force that made him take a half step backward. He caught hers. He lifted her up the way he had lifted her in the studio, settling her against his hip with an ease that surprised him every time. She was heavier than she had been 6 months ago. She was eating well. She was growing. "Hey, kid," he said, "keeping your mom out of trouble? She goes to bed too late and she worries too much," Rosie said seriously. But she smiles now. She did not used to smile. Colleen came out of the kitchen. She was wiping her hands on an apron. She was still thin, and she walked with a slight favor to her right leg, and she would carry both of those things for the rest of her life. But her face had color. Her eyes were clear. And when she saw Briggs standing in her diner holding her daughter, she smiled. And it was a smile that had been earned through suffering and was therefore worth more than any smile that had come easily. She crossed the room and hugged him. It was a fierce embrace, the kind that carries gratitude too large for language, and Briggs stood very still and let it happen because he was learning slowly that allowing people to be close to you was not the same thing as being weak. "You are late," Colleen said, pulling back and looking up at him. "Had to make a stop," Briggs replied. The chapter filed in behind him, filling the diner with noise and laughter and the smell of leather and road dust. Lorraine, who had been warned in advance, had prepared extra everything. Coffee flowed, plates piled up. The Rusty Spoon had never been this full, and it had never been this loud, and Lorraine did not mind one bit because the noise was the sound of life, and life was something this diner had not had enough of for a very long time. Rosie sat back in the booth across from Briggs. She had that serious expression again, the one that made her look 30 years older than she was. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "I never finished paying you." "For the coffee. I only gave you $1, but it cost $5. I owe you $4. The table went quiet. Grizz, who had been reaching for the sugar dispenser, stopped and turned to watch. Briggs looked at her. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his, cut the pocket next to his heart, the pocket where he had carried the USB drive and the photo of Jolene. He pulled out a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper. "Actually, kid," he said, We need to settle up. I brought your change. Rosie tore the paper off with the impatient enthusiasm of a child who has not yet learned to unwrap things carefully. Inside was a black picture frame, simple and clean. Pressed behind the glass was a crumpled, dirty $1 bill. The same bill. The bill she had carried through the rain. The bill she had held out with a shaking hand to the most frightening man in the diner. The bill that had started everything. Beneath it, engraved on a small brass plaque, were 6 words. The best investment I ever made. I did not spend it, Briggs said. His voice was quiet, pitched for her ears only, though in the silence of the table everyone heard. I kept it. That dollar did not buy me a coffee, Rosie. It bought something back that I thought was gone for good. He reached into his pocket again and produced a white envelope. He handed it to Colleen. And this is the change. Colleen opened the envelope. Inside was a check. She looked at the amount and her hand went to her mouth and the tears started and she shook her head and tried to push it back across the table. The boys passed the hat, Grizz announced from the counter, his booming voice filling the diner. 212 members contributed. For college or a pony or whatever the kid wants. We are bikers, not financial advisors. Rosie looked at the check in her mother's hands. She did not understand the number, not really, but she understood the tears on her mother's face and the way Colleen's hands were shaking and the way every biker in the room was trying very hard to look casual while also very clearly watching to see the reaction. Does this mean you are my dad now? Rosie asked. The laughter that erupted filled every corner of the Rusty Spoon and spilled out through the open windows into the spring air of Oak Haven's main street. It was the kind of laughter that heals things. The kind that you remember years later. Not the words that caused it, but the feeling of it, the way it made the room feel safe and warm and full. Briggs adjusted his sunglasses. He did it quickly because behind those dark lenses something was happening that he did not want 50 bikers to witness. His eyes were wet. Ironside, the man who had not cried since 1998, was losing the battle against his own tear ducts and was handling the defeat with as much dignity as the situation allowed. Let us start with Uncle Briggs, he said. Later, after the plates were cleared and the coffee cups refilled, and Grizz had challenged Rosie to an arm wrestling match that she won through what Grizz loudly claimed was cheating, but what everyone else recognized as a grown man letting a 7-year-old pin his wrist to the table, Briggs stepped outside. The afternoon was warm. The dogwoods were blooming along Main Street, their white petals drifting in the breeze like confetti. His Harley sat in his parking lot gleaming patient. It would carry him away from here back to the highway, back to the life he had chosen. That life had not changed. He was still a patch member. He still wore the cut. He was still Ironside. But he was also something else now, something he had not been in 5 years. He was someone a child trusted. He was someone a woman counted on. He was someone who had held a dying stranger's body in a living child's hand and had discovered that the two acts were connected, that protecting someone was the same thing as saving yourself. He pulled out his phone. He found the contact. He had updated it 100 times over the years, tracking her through social media, through mutual acquaintances, through the desperate detective work of a father who refuses to lose the thread. He knew her current number. He had known it for 2 years. He had never used it. He pressed call. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times. 4, 5. He closed his eyes. He prepared for the voicemail. He prepared to hear her recorded voice, bright and young and belonging to a life that did not include him, and he prepared to leave a message that would probably be deleted without being heard. The ringing stopped. Hello, a woman's voice. Cautious, uncertain, but familiar. So familiar that the sound of it cracked something open in Briggs's chest that he had spent 5 years sealing shut. Jolene, he said, it is your dad. Silence on the line. A silence that stretched for 3 seconds, 5 seconds, an eternity measured in heartbeats. I know who it is, Jolene said. Her voice was quiet, guarded, but she had not hung up. I saw the video. Everyone saw the video. Briggs leaned against his motorcycle. He looked up at the sky, which was blue for the first time in what felt like months. I am not calling to make excuses, he said. I am not calling to ask for anything. I just needed you to know that I have changed, not because I decided to. Because a little girl walked into a diner with a dollar bill and showed me what courage looks like, and it looks nothing like what I thought it did. Another silence, shorter this time. The girl in the pink raincoat, Jolene said. Rosie. Yeah, Briggs said. Rosie. He heard something on the other end of the line. A breath, an inhale that caught and trembled and then released. He knew that sound. He had made that sound himself an hour ago when Rosie had asked if he was her dad. I have questions, Jolene said. I have time, Briggs said. They talked for 47 minutes. He stood in the parking lot of the Rusty Spoon Diner in a town that had been saved not by a badge or a government or an institution, but by a little girl with a plan her mother made and a dollar bill she earned and a courage that came from the purest place courage can come from, which is love. And he talked to his daughter for the first time in 5 years. When he hung up, Rosie was standing in the doorway of the diner watching him. She was holding the framed dollar bill against her chest. Was that your daughter? She asked. Briggs nodded. Is she nice? I think so, Briggs said. I am going to find out. Rosie smiled. It was the smile of a child who understood in the way that children understand things without needing them, explained that the story she had started in a rainstorm with a crumpled dollar bill had rippled outward in directions she could never have predicted, touching lives she would never know, mending fractures she could not see. Good, Rosie said. Then she turned and went back inside to finish her coloring. Briggs Calloway mounted his Harley. He sat there for a moment, feeling the sun on his face and the weight of the machine beneath him, and the lightness in his chest where something heavy used to be. He reached into his cut and touched the spot where the dollar bill had rested for 6 months next to Jolene's photo. The frame was with Rosie now. The photo was still there, and beside it, folded small, was a new addition. A napkin from the Rusty Spoon, on which Jolene had texted him her address, and he had written it down because some things are too important to trust, to a phone that might break on a highway at 90 miles an hour. He kicked the engine to life. The Harley roared. He pulled out of the lot and turned east toward the highway, toward the sun, toward a daughter who was waiting. Behind him, through the open windows of the Rusty Spoon, he could hear Rosie laughing.